Hi, and welcome to Studio Agni. I'm John, and this is Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Jordan, thank you for coming.
Thanks for the invitation.
As you know, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is author of the bestseller 12 Rules for Life, professor on Toronto University, and one of the best antidote to chaos in this world. He's a speaker that inspires many peoples, including me, in trying to collectively make this world reasonable, solid, and soft-hearted.
Thank you very much.
So, we're gonna talking about stories, mythologies, fairy tales, movies, and cartoons, trying to understand their meaning and moral that they're aiming to deliver to us. Jordan are going to see them through lens of psychology and life itself. Well, Dr. Peterson, can you tell us why are we so related to stories, so that we love to see and talking about them?
We view the world essentially through a narrative lens, and I believe that we view the world through a narrative lens because the fundamental problem that we have to solve as living creatures is how we should act in the world. And that means how we should act to maintain ourselves, but also how we need to act in relationship to other people and in relationship to the broader world in order to maintain ourselves across time. So that's a complicated problem, right? It's not just how you survive, it's how you survive now and next week and next month and next year and 50 years from now, and maybe your descendants as well, if the culture is going to stabilize. And then not only you across all those time frames, but you and everyone else across all those time frames. It's a viciously difficult problem.
What they are means?
We have stories that are very old. Those are usually religious stories of one form or another, but they can be fairy tales. Because fairy tales, some people have traced fairy tales back, more than 10,000 years. And so they're part of an oral tradition. And oral traditions can last for tens of thousands of years. And, it's a story that's been told for 10,000 years is a funny kind of story. It's like people have remembered it and obviously modified it. It's like the game of telephone, where I tell you something and you whisper it to the person next to you and so on. It's like a game of telephone that's gone on for, 1,000 generations, and all that's left is what people remember. And maybe they remember what's important, because you tend to remember what's important. And it isn't necessarily the case that you know what the hell it means. You don't know what music means, but that doesn't stop you from listening to it. You don't know, generally speaking, what a movie that you see or a book that you read means, not if it's profound. It means more than you can understand, because otherwise why read it? Well, so the idea is this, is that we're necessarily nested inside moral systems. The moral systems are predicated on narratives, narrative dramas of sorts, and the moral systems are what orient us in life. And the reason to understand them to the degree that you can is because you need to know how to live.
What are stories about?
I want to bring what I told you abstractly down to earth, and then you can start thinking, well, do the conceptions that I've introduced to you, are they good for anything? Do they help? That's the order, descent into chaos, re-establishment of order. That's Paradise Lost, Profane History, Paradise Regained. It's the classic comedy, and that's the story of life. And the question is, how do you manage it? And so that's a question you really want to know the answer to. So you'll pay money, weirdly. You'll line up and pay money to see a story about that, even if you don't even know that that's what the story is about. And the reason for that is that actually part of you does know what the story is about. Your cognition has multiple layers. You understand things that you don't know you understand in ways that you don't understand.
What is the storyline or base or fundament that is same in every story?
You inhabit a story. The framework through which you look at the world is actually a story. And here's the story. The story is you're somewhere and you're going somewhere. That can be conceptual or whatever. But there's a gradient between where you are and where you're aiming at, which means no more really than you're doing something while you're sitting there. and hypothetically you're aiming for something better, and so you're in a state of insufficiency, always. The insufficiencies change, and then you're trying to rectify the insufficiency, and you presume that your current state is less preferable to the state that you're aiming at. And then the way that you bring those two together is, sometimes you can do it through thinking, but fundamentally you do it through action. You do it through acting in the world. And so that's sort of the answer in some sense to the mind-body problem. You have a conceptual structure, but when you implement it, you're implementing it not abstractly, you're implementing it through action. And so that's the basic story. It's not a very interesting story, but it's the framework through which you view the world. So it's a value-laden framework. Otherwise you wouldn't be able to act and you wouldn't know what to look at. So it's a value-laden framework. You look at the world through a value-laden framework. So then we might say, well, what is the optimal value-laden framework? That's what we're going to try to figure out. You know, like they had some axioms and we had some axioms, and if you're a moral relativist you might say, well, who's to say which set of axioms are better? Or even who's to claim that you could say that a set of axioms, one set is better than another? That's what took me into the study of the underlying stories, the fundamental stories upon which our culture, I believe, is based. And some of those are very old. Those are sources of our culture. And I think those stories are grounded in much older traditions.
Are fairy tales, movies and cartoons true?
Depends on what you mean by true. And it isn't obvious to me what you should mean when you say that something's true. And the reason it's not obvious is because we have this idea in our society, and it's a very profound idea, and that idea is that the ultimate truth is scientific truth. That tells us about the nature of the world, and it does that in a final way in some sense. There's no brooking any arguments about it. And the physicists have got it right, and that's why they can make hydrogen bombs, and that's a pretty good demonstration of their being right. But you don't act as if that's true, and you watch things and pay attention to things and are captivated by things that aren't predicated on those assumptions. And it seems to me that there is a problem of what the world is made out of, but there's a bigger problem, and that's the problem of how you should conduct yourself in the world. And that's really what you want to know. People want to know that more than anything, because you need to know. Now Paglia, her notion is that, you could think about it this way, is that articulated knowledge is embedded in inarticulate knowledge. And inarticulate knowledge is the domain of literature and art and high culture, let's say. And we sort of know what it means, but we don't exactly know what it means. It means more than we know. And then outside of that is what we don't know at all. And that's an idea that Jung developed as well, and maybe Paglia picked it up from Jung, because Jung believed that, you know, there was this domain that we had mastered in every domain, and then there was a domain outside of that which you could think of as unexplored territory, and what we met unexplored territory with was our creative imagination. And that what we were trying to do with our creative imagination is to figure out how to deal with that unexplored territory. We were producing dramas that we could act out that would help us deal with what we still hadn't mastered. And then outside of that, there's just what we don't know at all.
So you say that stories are nested inside us.
Human beings have a central narrative, and that central narrative is the dramatic expression of the necessary human system of values, and that's built into us. It's part of our nature. We have a nature as human beings. Paglia has this idea that the reason that you come to university and you study the humanities, or the proper reason if you do that, is not to engage in premature and destructive criticism of something that you don't even yet understand, but to learn as much as you can about art and literature and poetry and drama and fiction and religious thinking. What is all that? It's art. You know, it's culture. Music belongs in that category. It's an invitation to a drama. Now then the question might be, well, is the drama real? And the answer to that is, it depends on what you mean by real. I think that great dramas are more real than real. They're hyper real because they provide guidelines about how to act that are abstract and even perhaps generic, but applicable across an extraordinary broad range of situations. So imagine this, you get up in the morning, you do a bunch of things, and someone asks you what you're doing, what you did, and you tell them, well, the first thing I did this morning was open my eyes, and the second thing was think about whether I wanted to go back to sleep, and then I took off my blankets, and then I put my feet on the floor, and then I stood up, and I was blinking while I was doing all this, and I was also breathing, and then I looked for my clothes. And you really want to listen to that guy? You don't want to listen to that guy. It's like, why are you telling me that? I want you to tell me something interesting. Well, what is it that's interesting? And why isn't that interesting? It's not obvious. So then imagine the guy actually tells you a pretty good story, a little adventure. Probably he was doing something normal, something unexpected happened. He had to conjure up some new responses, and he either settled the problem or didn't settle the problem. Yeah, you're interested in that, especially if he settled the problem, because if he can tell you how when he encountered some unexplored territory he was able to sew it back together, then maybe you can do that when that thing happens, and that's pretty cheap wisdom for you.
What are fundamental constituent elements of stories?
What I think the fundamental constituent elements are of stories. Here's the fundamental narrative as far as the characters, let's say. And we're going to say that people are prone to characterize the world. We're social primates, we're social cognitive primates, so we tend to see the world through the lens of a social creature. And partly because we're concerned with acting in the world, and the world is mostly other people, then we conceptualize the ground of that structure for action in characterological terms. So the most fundamental reality is chaos. And chaos is what you don't understand at all. You can't even conceptualize it. You come into contact with it in bits and pieces. And chaos is what you experience when your story falls apart, and that's a descent to the underworld. That's chaos. And basically you live in order and chaos, and order is where, when you do what you think you should do, what you want to have happen, happens. That's order. That's explored territory. And chaos is when you do what you're supposed to do to get what you want, and it doesn't happen. And then that place that you're magically in when that happens, that's chaos. And it has different depths. So there's chaos itself, and then the next thing is fairly straightforward. You could think there's the individual exists in culture, and culture is embedded in nature. Pretty straightforward. Nature is mother nature for reasons we'll get into, and culture is father culture. And I think that's because the fundamental dominance hierarchies in human primates are masculine, and that nature is assimilated to the feminine because it's, well, for two reasons. First of all, females do the sexual selection among human beings, so they actually are nature from the Darwinian perspective. And second, nature is the productive biological force. And so we've always conceptualized males and females, and we've used that conceptualization to sort out the world at large. It's a metaphor. But it's not just a metaphor, it's reasonable to consider culture as a judgmental father. It's really reasonable because, you have a group of people around you, some friends, some people that watch you work, some judges, and that stretches across a very long expanse of time, and those people, as an aggregate, make an entity that is judging your reputation constantly. And it's perfectly reasonable to personify that because it's like a meta person that's watching you. And so it's a useful metaphor. There's a meta person that's watching you. Well, yeah, there is, obviously. Now, you could say, well, that's not real. It's like, it's not real the way a scientific truth is real. It's a different kind of real. Well, nature has two elements. It's destructive and creative. Obviously, there's the beauty of nature and its bountiful element, and then there's, Anopheles mosquitoes and elephantiasis and cancer and starvation and all the terrible elements of nature. And then there's culture, and culture is tyrannical because you have to shape yourself, involuntarily even, to get along with other people. You sacrifice a lot of yourself and develop yourself, but you sacrifice a lot of yourself in that endeavor, right? We have to kind of average ourselves out in order to to live together, and some societies are more tyrannical than others, but there's always a tyrannical element. You see that at university, you know, you guys know that to some degree, this is such a big place, it's easy to feel like a number here, and that whether or not you're here or not doesn't matter. The institution doesn't care. Well, that's the tyrannical element of it. Now, it does care because here you are and you're getting educated and all that, and so maybe that's positive. But it's got both. These characters always have two sides. You know, there's the negative side and the positive side of nature. And there's the negative side and the positive side of culture. And then there's the individual. So the individual is like standing on an island in the midst of an ocean. That's a good imagistic conceptualization of your position. There's solid ground, it has a limited expanse, and outside of that is everything you don't understand. And you as an individual have a positive and negative element as well. And that's the hero and the villain. And of course, what good is a story without a hero and a villain? And the villain is the person who isn't acting like a person should act, and the hero is the person who's acting like a person should act. And so you go to movies and you read books, and there's heroes and there's villains, and to some degree what you're doing is you're fleshing out your notion of a villain. You know, you read about 30 villains and you think, well, there's something villainous about the villains that's the central element of villainy, whatever that is, and you could imagine you construct out a meta-villain and a meta-hero, and those are the characters in religious stories, generally speaking. You have to recognize that in yourself, or it's useful to, because otherwise you underestimate. Why might you be villainous? Well, first of all, because you can be. That's a big deal. You can be. It's actually an offshoot of empathy. And that's why in many systems of thinking, the world is conceptualized as a battle between good and evil. And it's an appropriate conceptualization. It's a meta-conceptualization.
Mythological hero is the fundament of every story, but what he presents.
One way of conceptualizing yourself is not as order and not as chaos, but as the thing that traverses between the two domains. And that, I would say, is the mythological hero.
Well, this was everything for now. Jordan, thank you very much.
It's nice to be in front of all you people.
If you like it, subscribe on our channel and keep watching StoryT Talking, and you will see more clips like this. Bye.